Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Friday, February 28th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan, RCP contributor Richard Porter, and our White House correspondent Phil Wegmann. So, gentlemen, meeting today at the White House between Zelensky of Ukraine and Donald Trump and Vice President Vance. I don't think I've ever seen anything else quite like it. The three of them talking over each other. And ended apparently with Zelensky being asked to leave the White House. Phil, you were at the White House today. What happened?
So that's right, Andy. My sources here confirmed that Ukrainian President Zelensky was essentially kicked out of the White House. Some said that that's how you could describe it or not, but he was going home. And then we saw the motorcade depart from White House grounds here. The impetus for really this unprecedented exchange of words and fireworks was you saw Zelensky in the Oval Office questioning the efficacy of diplomatic efforts. And he ran through a recent list of all of the agreements that Russia had made with his country only to break them. This was too much for Vice President Vance, who then shot back that Zelensky was being ungrateful. He said, "Have you ever said thank you?" Vance pointed back to Zelensky's visit in Pennsylvania with Democrats before the election, and it fell apart very quickly. Now we've expected, a temperamental president and vice president, but we've never seen diplomatic relations break down like this. And so Zelensky, who showed up to the White House without a suit, left the White House without signing this much vaunted and celebrated minerals deal.
Wow. So, Tom, diplomacy is a delicate dance. It's all planned out in advance. These things. Have you ever seen anything in the White House that was so unscripted? Is this how damaging is this for Zelensky? I guess is the question.
I have never seen anything like this, and I think it was very damaging for Zelensky. Look, the meeting started great, right? Trump was very gracious and welcoming him, and they had some pleasantries back and forth, and it looked like everything was going fine. And then, as Phil said, Zelensky kind of, got out over his skis a little bit, and certainly, raised the ire of not only J.D. Vance but the president himself, and just could not, and didn't seem very interested in trying to. I kept waiting for someone to say, "Okay, everybody, calm down. Let's," but it just didn't happen. And then, Trump released a statement afterwards saying, effectively, this was a good thing. The American people needed to see this, and through this emotion, that he determined that Zelensky's not ready for peace, and he's welcome to come back when he's ready for peace. So, effectively, put the peace negotiations sort of on the shelf, and I think that is very damaging for Zelensky. I think he misread the entire moment, and when you do that with Trump, look out, because he's not going to hold back.
Richard, but the optics of this, you invite someone into your house. He's sitting there. It's 2-on-1. I'm just putting this sort of in the down where the goats can get it, as our friend Carl Cannon says. The optics seem to me two guys sort of beating up on this guy who's obviously been trying to lead his country through a war, saying you somehow mismanaged the war. Zelensky's English is broken, so lots of opportunity for miscommunication. And I just wonder, certainly bad for Zelensky, but is it damaging for Trump and Vance to be seen in this light, do you think?
Well, I think what you saw was they were kind of reaffirming the U.S.'s position. Trump had made clear before Zelensky went into a kind of a negotiation mode that he was going to do a ceasefire first with the security deal, with the minerals deal, and that security would come after that. And Zelensky kind of launched into all the reasons why he had to have security before he would sign any ceasefire. He basically said, "I am not doing a ceasefire deal without a security deal." right after the president had said, we're not going to do security until after we sign a ceasefire. So he basically was rejecting, sitting next to the president's terms. So that's what came before that snippet that you're talking about, where they got into an exchange, because he chose that moment to, sitting in the Oval Office, to basically say, hey, I'm not signing anything until I know I have security. I understand where he's coming from, but that's just not the deal. I mean, he's sitting there with a donor state that's giving him arms that we don't have to give to him, right? And so we're there supporting peace. And the idea that you're going to start renegotiating essentially the deal, the terms under which you walked into the Oval Office, was, I think, a major mistake.
Phil, what happens next?
Well, certainly we expect Zelensky to go hat in hand to some of these other European nations that have supported him. But Richard is right. The United States has been the most generous and the most consistent of allies to Ukraine thus far. My sources here at the White House, they did not expect this from Zelensky. What we saw from French President Emmanuel Macron and also British Prime Minister Starmer was that those guys understood the stage directions. They realized that something had changed in between Biden and Trump. They were very complimentary. They praised him about the opportunity to create peace. And then they politely pushed back and they politely had some negotiations. Zelensky, and I think that maybe perhaps, English being a second language is the answer for some of the abruptness here. Like Richard said, he tried to sort of negotiate, and that was out of bounds. You saw Vance say that it was very disrespectful for him to try and negotiate in front of reporters. And that's the key thing here. This was happening in front of reporters in the Oval Office, not as we would have expected. They hash out details over lunch.
And is this, but, Phil, I'm just curious. This can't be viewed as a good thing for the White House. This didn't have the feeling to me of sort of a staged wrestling event, which is, sometimes the way I think it's not a bad way to view what Trump does. Trump sometimes stages these kinds of arguments and fights. This didn't have that feeling. So, I mean, we can blame Zelensky, but, this was Trump's meetings, Trump's White House. He's sitting there with his vice president. I'm just wondering what sort of the long-term implications that are. I mean, is this a team that's not really ready for this kind of negotiation, I guess?
Well, certainly, Secretary of State Marco Rubio did not expect this meeting to go this way. All of us were prepared for a 1 o'clock press conference where it was expected that Zelensky was going to be signing this minerals deal, that the continued economic partnership would lead to sort of a indirect national security guarantee. And no one expected this. What does this mean for Zelensky in the United States? Well, the White House had done a lot of the legwork, a lot of the sort of setting of the foundation with Britain and France, talking about a peacekeeping force there, sort of beginning the negotiations to get to negotiations. And now it seems that all of that is for naught.
Richard, is this team ready for this kind of diplomacy, I think?
Yeah, I think that they were there expecting a different partner. I mean, the things move fast. I mean, there was nothing slow about this. Everything about the Trump administration has been on the ball. They make things happen, and they're driving towards a conclusion. And I think Zelensky is temperamentally, emotionally not ready for peace. I mean, I think that's sort of what the president said, and I think you saw it today. He is, of course, because of the brutality of the terrible things that have occurred, but that's what happens when wars end. I mean, in the Korean War, we had an armistice. There was a DMZ. Terrible things happened. You can fight right to the bitter end, but if we fight to the bitter end, Ukraine is going to lose. And that was the point that Trump was making to him. They have been losing of late. The last 2 years, all they've done is lose territory. They had a little bit of an incursion, but beyond that, this is not a war. Anybody that plays the board game Risk understands Ukraine loses this war the longer it goes on. And so I think Zelensky has to accept where we are, get the deal closed, get the best deal he can, and get as much security as he can. I mean, I think that's sort of where you are. It's not going to be perfect. He's not going to get Russia to go all the way back to the, pre-2014 lines. They're not going to give up, all that territory. They're not going to give up the Crimean Peninsula, which, by the way, is 70% Russian. So, I mean, I think that there's not a practicality that Zelensky's bringing to the table. Yes, it's been terrible. It's awful. You can say all that. But at the end of the day, if you want the war to end, you're going to have to swallow hard and make some things happen.
Well, Tom, I think what he's asking for is security guarantees. And if you go back to Korea, which we've talked about this before on the show, it does seem to me that there's something to be said in terms of an armistice, using the existing battlefield sort of lines as sort of where you start this thing. But that only works if you guarantee, someone's got to guarantee the territorial integrity of what's left of Ukraine. Is Zelensky wrong to be pushing so hard for that?
I don't know that he's wrong to push for that, but he has to be willing to accept that he won't get that, because, as Richard pointed out, Trump is saying we're not doing that. And that's not how this negotiation is going to go. We're going to get a deal first. We're going to get a ceasefire, and then we'll deal with any sort of security guarantees afterwards. I mean, I think Trump expects all the parties, in Trump's mind, this is going to be a great deal, and all the parties are going to live up to it, and we won't have to worry about Putin's going to stay put, Ukraine's going to stay put. So this is something that may or may not be an issue in the future, and let's deal with it when it happens. That's kind of Trump's attitude, and Zelensky doesn't want to go there. I think the main thing here, to Phil's point, and this is what got JD Vance pissed off, quite frankly, was that Zelensky was doing this in the Oval Office in front of the media. Right? This is a negotiation. This is what would happen behind closed doors, and should happen, quite frankly, behind closed doors. You smile, you shake hands, you present sort of a pleasant, united front, and then you go back behind closed doors, and that's when you yell and you insult each other and you hash things out. And I don't think, it certainly wasn't good for Zelensky. It wasn't great for the Trump administration either. JD Vance telling him, have you ever said thank you? Well, he said thank you lots of times to the United States. He's been very effusive in his praise but JD Vance said, in this meeting, have you said thank you? As if that was a precondition or something. So in that sense, it wasn't great. Again, I expect, as a political issue, all the Democrats and progressives are horrified by what they saw, and all the folks who like Trump and already support Trump probably thought this was a good thing. And so it's like, how do independents think? Is this really going to move the needle one way or the other? Probably not. But it was, to just sort of close the circle on it, it was the most fascinating and riveting 49 minutes of television that any of us have seen in a long, long time.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up in a minute, Phil, but I got one last question for you, and that is the JD Vance question. What was the thinking of having JD Vance in this meeting? It was sort of just, maybe you'd have the Secretary of State there, but to have the Vice President there, and then have the Vice President sort of speak so, really to sort of take a leading role in the meeting.
Yeah, normally these bilaterals, the way that the previous administration did them, it would be the president and then the foreign leader. This time they decided to bring the entire team. Not only was the vice president there, but so was the Secretary of State and some of the corresponding Ukrainian officials. I think that the takeaway here is that the rest of the world sort of realized that the game had changed. And Vance represents that change as much as Donald Trump. He has said that his interest is with the United States, not with what's going on in Eastern Europe. The only person who didn't seem to get that memo was Ukrainian President Zelensky. And I think that, he paid the price. This was certainly, in the short term, not the best tactical way to go about beginning negotiations with your biggest client state.
Yeah. All right. Well, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP president and co-founder Tom Bevan and RCP contributor Richard Porter. So, gentlemen, today there was an economic blackout across the United States. It was called for by a group called People's Union USA. They are committed to what they call economic resistance, government accountability, corporate reform. The idea was consumers were not supposed to spend any money for 24 hours except for local businesses. And I guess if you need your prescription refilled, that was about it. Tom, what do you make of the protest? And did you put your black card on hold for the day? And
I did not. Listen, I'm not into that kind of activism. I remember saying that, I grew up in Seattle. I was a Sonics fan. And when Howard Schultz, who owned Starbucks, sold out Seattle and sold the team to Oklahoma City, I said, I'd never go to Starbucks again. And I was there the next day. I don't really like my willpower. I do not make political statements via my consumption habits. So, look, this is all performative art, right? I mean, this doesn't mean anything. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to have any sort of material impact on the economy. And so if it makes people feel better about their political positions and this is what they want to do, great. Knock yourself out. But, and they got a story in the media, which is ultimately, I think, what they were after, because it's certainly not going to have any sort of impact on the stores that, Target and some of these other stores that they're upset because they rolled back some of their, trans stuff or the DEI stuff.
Yeah, Richard, what'd you make of the protest? And I guess we'll find out tonight whether or not that has any effect.
Well, I do think that boycotts have become a key element of how the left operates. But broad scale boycotts like this, especially one that doesn't have a lot of support and that's barely known about, is going to be a big nothing. I was in the grocery store today. It was just as full as it always is. And so there's nothing really happening. When they're more successful with their boycotts, they're more narrow scale boycotts. For example, when they target advertisers, we've seen that as a tool of trying to regulate speech. And in terms of targeting finance companies, where that's another way to try to target them to do things for climate change. So when they have narrow scale boycotts where they can focus and embarrass, name and shame people, they're more successful than they are this broad-based kind of amorphous, no one goes shopping today. Guess what? Everybody's shopping today. It was a news story, as Tom said. But I would love to see the end of boycotts. I mean, I do think using boycotts as an economic weapon is something that we need to think about. How do we deal with that in recognition of the fact that we do have the First Amendment rights to freedom of associate, not to shop, and that sort of thing. I mean, but using boycotts as a tool to stop people from speaking is a problem, for example.
Yeah. My problem with it, I guess, is I just couldn't figure out what the heck they were boycotting for. I mean, I understand, you don't want to buy anything from big box stores for a day, but is it because the prices are too high? I saw that argument one place that they're gouging us. Was it because of the DEI? Was it because the whole system of capitalism is rigged against you, and so you're not going to participate for 24 hours? And I just think that they got to get their story straight. And I think of when people went after Bud Light, for example, that was pretty specific, and you could say, I'm not buying Bud Light anymore because of this one thing. And the two were tied, and it seemed to have some effect. But this sort of amorphous thing, it's sort of, not that I'm going to try to give the left any advice about how to do things, but it also shows how feckless it is, because if it's so diffuse, but it's supposed to be this big deal, and then nothing happens, it's like, wow, maybe we aren't as powerful as consumers as we thought we were, Tom.
Listen, part of the fecklessness is it's a day. I mean, really, one day. It's like when everybody, they boycotted Twitter for like 16 hours and then they're back. I mean, it's like the Hamas folks at Princeton University were going to do a starvation protest, right? And, like a couple days later, they were eating sandwiches. I mean, it's like, if you're going to do something, you better do it, right? Do a month and then I'll be impressed by you. A day is like, oh, okay. So they're going to go get their toothpaste and toilet paper from the store tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think they're probably trying to make it a thing, like the last day of Black History Month every year. We'll have like a Black Friday. We're going to have the Blackout Day. I mean, they're probably looking for some kind of continuation. I don't think this has been a great launch for them, honestly. And the less boycotts we have, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, they do have 2 more days of consumer rage planned over the next couple of months. So we'll see if it amounts to anything. But Richard, I want to talk about the Supreme Court for a second. two things, but first, I'm curious about your view on this arguments that were heard on Wednesday about reverse discrimination. This was a woman named Marlene Ames, who started working at Youth Services Department as a secretary back in 2024. Anyway, as things went along, she claims that she's been passed over for promotions for her gay coworkers. The Supreme Court seemed to feel like they were going to maybe take this case. What did you make of it, and what's the significance?
What they're going to do is they're going to strike down a burden that the Sixth Circuit, where this case came out of, layered onto cases involving reverse discrimination. So typically you think about the discrimination cases as protecting groups where there's been historical discrimination. But the law is neutral. And so what the Supreme Court was basically saying today is that the law goes both ways, and it should be applied in the same manner. And what the Sixth Circuit had done, where this case came out of, is they had added an additional condition if you had a reverse discrimination case, where you had to prove more than if you were claiming that I was being discriminated against because I was gay, right? So because there is a history of discrimination against gay people, I don't have to prove certain things. But if you're straight, well, then we're going to make you prove more things in order to carry your burden of proof. And the Supreme Court said basically, and it looked like it's going to be a unanimous case, Ohio was agreeing to it as well. As one of the justices, Neil Gorsuch, said, we're in radical agreement with regard to this issue, that the law is the same and should be applied equally regardless of what a person's status is.
What a novel concept, Richard.
I know.
My gosh.
Yeah.
What's gotten into everybody?
Right. Radical agreement. Radical agreement. I like that.
So Richard, what are the possible ramifications of this, I guess?
Well, what I think it does is that it kind of ties into the end of DEI, which is, we're moving back. I think the culture is moving back, the law is moving back, and certainly the administration is kind of insisting that we move back to a world where we have an equal application of law, where we move towards a situation of colorblindness as opposed to color consciousness, back to a world of equality as opposed to equity. This has been an ideology that, the Biden administration came in and they dropped the word equality and they started talking about equity. Biden issued a executive order asking every agency to come up with plans for establishing equity. And in this context, what equity means is retributive justice, in the sense that it's a transaction, that if you're Black, you get something more. Or if you're another disadvantaged group, you get a special deal. And all that's been tossed out. The administration has revoked that, and we're moving back to a world where equality before the law and equal standing, as I've written before with RealClearPolitics, this is sort of love-based. What makes America so special is this idea that love thy neighbor is really an equalizing force. And that's, I think, where we're going, is back to a concept that had been enshrined in the law. Martin Luther King used it and amplified it. And we're going back to that standard, I think.
So, Tom, what are the politics of this? I mean, as we move this way, as if Richard's correct and we're going in that direction, how does it play out politically, especially for the White House?
I think it's a winner politically. I mean, I think that's, again, the pendulum is swinging back. And to the extent, look, the Supreme Court, to the extent it is a unanimous decision and any of the liberals join in with the conservative members of the court, I think that will give it sort of additional momentum and impetus. There was this editorial in the New York Times on free speech talking about, and this is what Richard framed it perfectly, and that's what the New York Times was writing about. They said, oh, there's a MAGA war on free speech, right? And that the Trump administration, and we talked about, well, how the AP has changed the style book to become sort of incorporate some of this woke stuff and more progressive stuff over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And that the administrations, the Obama administration and the Biden administration, particularly in the last few years, have injected all of this DEI stuff into the government, into the regulations, into the functioning of these agencies. And the argument of the New York Times basically is that Well, opposing any of those things is a war on free speech. How can you possibly tell you just don't like this speech, therefore it's a war on free speech? And the idea is that they've managed, the media and the government has managed to move the Overton window, shift it to the left, dramatically in some instances over the last 15 or 20 years. And the Trump administration and other parts of the culture are trying to sort of roll some of that stuff back. And in the minds of the New York Times, and I guess people on the left, that's considered a war on free speech because it's dictating to folks, you can't say this, you can't say that. I think for a vast majority of folks, though, including folks on the right, would say that this goes back to the Victor Davis Hanson. This is not a revolution. This is a counter-revolution. This is a returning of our politics and our culture to some sort of equilibrium, some sort of stasis that is neutral, that is opportunity-based, and we don't identify and categorize and divide people by their race, their gender, their sexual preference, or whatever. And so in that sense, I think this case is a move in the right direction.
It was interesting.
Richard, you got 30 seconds.
Yeah, the New York Times was arguing that by taking off DEI language out of the websites that the government puts up, that was somehow limiting free speech. Of course, you can go out and argue for DEI in the town square. No one's saying, you can't do that. But the idea that the administration can't change its own websites to take out language about policies they disagree with was just nonsense. So it's interesting how, though, they're trying to dress up what they're doing as constitutional issues as opposed to policy issues. And it didn't work, I don't think.
Huh. All right. Well, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Richard Porter and Tom Bevan, but don't go away. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm talking with John Feehery. He's a Republican strategist and a principal at the firm EFB Advocacy. John, welcome back to the program.
Hey, great to be with you. Thank you.
So, John, let's talk about the Hill this week. The Republicans managed to pass a budget in the House, but there's still a lot of work to do. The key deadline is March 14th, when we once again face a government shutdown. What's the state of play right now?
Well, listen, I think that Mike Johnson needs a lot of credit. He not only passed the budget, but he did it on a Tuesday, and he did it after a recess. Which is shocking to me as someone who worked in a whip office. It's very hard to do. So whatever those town hall meetings that were going on to try to, stir up opposition to the budget clearly didn't work because Johnson was able to get that done. Obviously the Senate had passed their version of the budget, which was much different than the House version the weekend before. And they had to reconcile a lot of big pieces. The number one thing, are you going to do two reconciliation bills or one? Donald Trump wants one big, beautiful bill. And I think that the fact that the House was able to pass that one big, beautiful bill makes that more possible on the reconciliation side. As you pointed out, on the spending side, you have the March 14th deadline, which is, this is another Perils of Pauline kind of moment where, the damsel in distress is tied up on the railroad tracks, and you've got to have Dudley Do-Right come in and save the day. Will there be a shutdown? I don't think it's in either party's strategic interests. Democrats don't typically like to have government shut down, but they like to blame the Republicans. Republicans have been pretty clear that they don't want to have the government shut down. The big question is, do they do a rest of the year continuing resolution, or do they do a stopgap, kick the can down the road a couple of weeks, or do they get the omnibus bill passed? And I think they're probably going to end up doing a long-term CR, which is not really good for the Department of Defense. They're against it, but it seems that that's where they're headed.
So the long-term CR, tell our listeners and viewers, what exactly would that mean?
It means that all the appropriation bills that have been funded at the same level they've been funded at will continue that same funding from the budget from last year, or the 25 budget. So it would mean very little disruption in the current state of being. That being said, one of the big points of contention is, what are you going to do with all these DOGE cuts?
I was going to say, yeah,
all these government employees that have lost their job.
Yeah.
And that's That's a point of negotiation. There's also, the Democrats want some assurances that Trump's not going to be able to zero out all these congressionally mandated budgets for all these departments. And that's another point of contention. So a lot of hard work to do in 2 weeks. We'll see how it works out.
Yeah, so let's just back up on this DOGE thing for a minute, because it is sort of be careful what you wish for, because DOGE identifies these cuts, eliminating AID, a bunch of other stuff, and the fiscal hawks in the GOP say, great, let's do this. We're supporting the president's agenda. And John Thune and the people on the Senate side at least say not so fast. So where does the president come down in all that then?
Well, that's a really good question. Where does the president come down? I think that the president wants all the above strategy. He wants everything he can get his hands on, everything passed as possible. He wants the DOGE cuts. And he also wants his tax bill passed, and he also wants the things that he wants in the tax bill, which includes no tax on tips and no tax on Social Security. So he said, the president has not really weighed in on is which tactic the House or the Senate uses. And he says he wants one big, beautiful bill. Then he goes to the Senate and says, yeah, pass whatever you want. He just wants something passed. He's not really, when it comes to House or Senate procedure, he's not really much of a detail guy.
Yeah, I'm talking to John Feehery about what's going on the Hill. I want to ask you about another question, which is sort of these town hall meetings that have been going on around the country. And the New York Times and others have reported that they sort of is a groundswell of protest against Republicans in their districts. Speaker Johnson says these are paid protesters. What's going on really? And does it matter whether, and I guess the question is, are they paid or not? Let's put that aside for a second. But the fact, how do these House members view these kinds of meetings? I guess let's start with that.
Well, I mean, when I talk to congressional offices, the one question they're asking themselves is, why the hell will we do a town hall meeting given the circumstances right now? When I worked for Denny Hastert, he never did a town hall meeting. He communicated with his constituents many other ways, because they're kind of built for town hall meetings like this are built for, the viral moment. And so it really does mean that, you shouldn't put yourself in those circumstances. Do they really have an impact? Listen, if you're a laid off federal worker and now you get some time on your hands, I bet you those people showed up at whatever town hall meeting was around them. And then there's always some paid protesters. These are the same people who have been protesting the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. They all have pink hair, and I've seen them before. And they are, some of them paid, and some of them just like to be activists, and this is what they do. And then there are probably a few constituents that are concerned. Will it have an impact? I don't think it has any impact on the decision-making process of the Republicans. That being said, Republicans do not really want to pass a huge Medicaid cut, because that will not be very popular with their constituents.
Yeah, let's just talk about that Medicaid cut for a second, because that does seem to be the thing where the Democrats looking for an issue that they can sort of latch on to. We got about a minute here, John. Is Medicaid the big issue?
Well, I mean, you can find a lot of savings in the Medicaid program. We've done it in the past. That being said, Medicaid is a lot of Republicans are on Medicaid, which is kind of an indictment of our healthcare system and how many people are struggling in this economy. And who else doesn't want to cut Medicaid benefits? And that's President Trump. So I think everyone kind of understands the politics. I think the Energy and Commerce Committee understands, that they have to be very careful on this. And I think that ultimately that's what they're going to decide to do.
Hey, John, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Real Clear Politics. We'll be back after this.
Welcome back to the show for our last segment this week. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. Talking now with an old friend, Sam Jeffries, who used to work for us. He's now a freelance writer. But he's written an extraordinary review of a film, and we don't usually do film reviews on this show, but you'll see right away why it's relevant to Real Clear Politics. It appeared in Real Clear Books and Culture on February 19th. I urge you to go find it. It's a review of the movie September 5th. And we're 3 days away from I guess the Oscars are in 2 days, Sunday night. But this was an extraordinary film at a time at a time when everybody needs to see it. It's about the massacre of the Israeli athletes in the 1972 Olympics. So I want to ask you a few questions about it. But first, tell me why did you decide to why did you decide to write about this movie?
Yeah, I had learned about this movie in the fall, thought it was an incredibly different examination of some pretty well-trodden ground. Obviously, the Spielberg
Well, Steven
thriller,
Spielberg did Munich. Yeah.
yeah, did Munich, yeah, about 20 years ago. And usually when Steven touches it, you don't get to touch it again, right? It's no longer welcome for public play. But they decided to go back. Tim Fellbaum, who's a first-time director, went back and literally went through the lens of ABC Sports. And I found it such a different way to think about this particular moment in history. I'm a sucker for historical talkie dramas, so they take my money. But this one in particular, it went through the lens of a sports station grappling to try and consider the ramifications of covering a hostage crisis. And it just so happens that we are in the middle of yet another Israeli hostage crisis. And because of that, the movie's been protested and been a target of criticism by people who will never see it in the first place.
You mean by pro-Hamas types?
Yeah, by the Hamasniks for sure. They protested theaters and that type of thing. And so I said, well, that's all the more reason for me to lift this up.
All right, so let's go back. Sam, I don't think you were born then. I remember it clearly. 1972 Olympics. Germany was showcasing itself before the world. They hadn't had that many opportunities since the end of World War II to do this, and especially because the political backdrop then was the 1936 Olympics, with Adolf Hitler used to showcase supposed Aryan superiority, except that Jesse Owens stole his thunder. But this was the new Germany, and things were going amazingly well for Germany and for Americans, because an American Jewish athlete, Mark Spitz, demonstrated before this happened, before the attack, because remember the swimming's early in the Olympic program. It is now. He'd been the star of the 1968 Olympics. He was arguably the greatest athlete in the world that week. He won 7 gold medals and broke seven world's records. And then this happened. They hustled him out of the rumor was the United States Marines took him to England for safekeeping. But it showed, this was the backdrop of this, and people were so horrified by it, and we're still being horrified by it. You point out. So what are the lessons? What are the lessons for the media that were being explored in this film, Sam?
Yeah, that's what I think the film does best, is grapple with the question not of the hostages themselves and what would make for compelling cinema, but instead, what is the role of media to broadcast or not the actions of terrorists? And in this instance, to broadcast them live. Obviously, fast forward, we've seen terrorists are determined to broadcast their own actions live, and then there are questions put to YouTube and to X and to all these other platforms on whether or not they should host them. But then it was a real-time conundrum, so much so that there's a moment in the movie when they realize that the flickering they're seeing in the hotel rooms,
the terrorists
are the terrorists are the terrorists watching themselves on TV and understanding where snipers are being set up by the German police. And so are they aiding and abetting the terrorists in avoiding, the efforts to take them down? And then later on, are they making these people superstars? And I think they choose to broadcast it. Obviously, that's the crux. That's the crux of the moral conundrum they're faced with and the choice they make. But in doing so, they give a platform to the worst people in the world, and they tell those people's successors that this is the way it can be going forward.
Well, you're listening to Sam Jeffries talk about the movie September 5th, which came along at just a fascinating time and a terrible time in a way. If you've been watching, and I've been writing about the hostages in being held in Gaza. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief of Real Clear Politics. Sam, you have an interesting passage in your piece that you wrote that the terrorists, basically one of the lessons they got is that no publicity is bad publicity. And we saw this in the October 7th massacre. They broadcast their crimes. They showed videos of them mutilating people and killing people and setting women up for rape. And of course, then their apologists still deny that it happened, even while they're bragging about it. But is there are those ethical questions moot now because everybody's his own director? Everybody can post anything they want to YouTube?
I don't think they're moot. I think the legacy media still has a role to play in deciding what is and what isn't news, and I think that social media platforms do as well. This is not new. The ISIS beheading videos, 12 years ago, 2013, 2014, became a sensation, and Google was faced with the conundrum: do we host these or not? So I think there are still choices to be made by powerful people on whether or not you show terror, and whether or not showing terror encourages further terror. That's certainly put to folks in 2025, just as it was in 1972.
All right, tell us a little bit about the director of this picture, September 5th. You noted when we started talking today, and somewhat puckishly in your piece, once Steven Spielberg tackles a subject, filmmakers are hesitant to go there. There's not a lot of movies about great white sharks because Jaws was sort of, was the story. But this director, he has willing to gone where Steve Spielberg got. And tell us a little bit about him and how the two films differ.
Yeah, Tim Philibom is a Swiss director. He was actually trained in Munich, which I think is so interesting. And they say write what you know. Certainly, Tim, in writing the screenplay, which is now up for Best Original Screenplay on Sunday, wrote what he knew and wrote it in a way that grappled so differently than Spielberg, not with questions of Israeli vengeance or Jewish vengeance against the people who have come to find and hunt and kill Jews, but instead this moral question of what is the role of media? Can sports journalists become hard news journalists in real time? And what are the role of the hosts, in this case, the Germans, in moderating that moral conversation? And the German helper in the movie, she's the translator. She's sitting there, she's listening to the police scanner, and she's kind of cast off early on and then creeps back in out of necessity. I thought it was one of the richer characters, and really asked that question of that next generation of Germans, right? Not the Nazi generation, but the next generation. How much do we need to grapple with our own shame? Are we willing to face it? And when it happens again, what's our role in making sure that the last great superpower still is able to face it in a different way than we do?
And it also shows you why these, history books get written, even though ground has been covered, because what's happened in the world has changed, and we see things through different contexts. Right now,
Absolutely.
I had Liana Fix, fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, on yesterday on a show, and she's German, and she talked about the German elections. And now Germany is a different country than it was in 1972, and it's grappling with millions of immigrants, many of them from Islamic countries or who are practicing Muslims, who do not share the shame of people who had been their grandparents, but they weren't even German at the time. And so Germany is wrestling with how to modulate this multicultural society while remembering its really debt to world Jewry.
Absolutely. And Germany is not the same place it was in 1972, but it's not even the same place it was in 2015, right? It's a different world, and the homegrown extremism, which does ignore German values, and rightly or wrongly, the recent and not so recent history forces us, I think, the world writ large, to think differently about how Germans still must be accountable for the actions of their forefathers.
We've got 30 seconds left, Sam. So Sunday night is the Oscars. Do you think September 5th is going to win? And do you have any other interesting predictions?
I think that Tim's screenplay is going to be edged out by The Brutalist, which is a shame. I enjoyed it. I found it interesting, but sometimes there's a freight train and you got to get out of the way. And Conclave for Best Picture by far. Not a question there.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam. You've been listening to Sam Jeffries, freelance writer and a film buff and also a history buff. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, RealClearPolitics. You've been listening to RCP on SiriusXM Radio or watching on our podcast. Have a great weekend and enjoy the Oscars.